Imagine standing in the Agora of Athens around 600 BC. The marble temples and bustling markets show a city on the rise. But behind the chatter of merchants and the laughter of children, there is another sound, the quiet despair of men who have lost everything to debt. A farmer in Attica tills soil that is no longer his own. His harvest belongs to a creditor in the city. A mother watches as her children are led away, pledged as servants because the family could not pay back a barley loan. On the hills outside Athens, markers called horoi are hammered into fields, stone signposts declaring that the land, once free, is now collateral. Debt in Athens was not just numbers scratched on wax tablets, it was chains on the body. A poor farmer who failed to pay could be forced into debt bondage, enslaved to his creditor until the obligation was cleared. If he could not clear it, his family could be sold abroad. The wealthy grew richer, absorbing more farmland, hiring more bonded laborers, and tightening their hold on politics. Meanwhile, the smallholders, the backbone of the polis, were vanishing. Some fled to other cities, others rebelled in riots. Athens teetered on the edge of collapse. This was not simply an economic crisis, it was a moral one. Could a city call itself free if its citizens lived in chains? Could democracy survive if ordinary people were drowning in obligations they could never escape? It was in this moment of tension, when Athens risked tearing itself apart, that the city turned to one man, Solon. And what he chose to do with debt would shape not only Athens, but the idea of democracy itself. To understand Athens' crisis, we need to step into the machinery of its economy. Most Athenians were small farmers, scraping a living from thin, rocky soil. When harvest failed, or wars disrupted trade, they had little choice but to borrow. Creditors were usually aristocrats, wealthy landowners who had grain or silver reserves. Loans came with steep terms. Interest could climb to 1/6 of the loan per year, a burden nearly impossible to meet after a bad season. Repayment was not abstract. If you could not pay in silver, you paid in kind, with your harvest, your land, or your labor. The harshest rule was debt bondage. If your farm and possessions could not cover what you owed, you yourself became collateral. You worked as a servant for your creditor, often indefinitely. Worse still, your children could be seized as security and sold abroad. Evidence of this system survives in the form of horoi, stone boundary markers dug into the soil. These markers were physical announcements. This land is pledged to a creditor. They were everywhere in Attica. To walk through the countryside was to see the proof of debt's grip. For the wealthy, this system was a goldmine. They grew estates by swallowing small plots, and they used bonded labor to increase output. For the poor, it was a death spiral. Once you slipped into debt, there was almost no way out. The parallels today are striking. Think of a student who borrows tens of thousands for tuition, only to graduate into a stagnant job market, or a family that mortgages a house at the edge of their budget, only to be crushed when interest rates rise. Like Athens, modern societies celebrate credit as opportunity, but for many it becomes a lifetime trap. Athens discovered early what Babylon had already known. Credit is powerful, but when it hardens into chains, it corrodes the foundation of society itself. By the early 6th century BC, the pressure was unbearable. The city buzzed with discontent. Farmers abandoned fields rather than see them seized. Families fled abroad to escape bondage. Bands of desperate debtors threatened open revolt. Athens was splitting in two. On one side stood the aristocrats clutching wealth and land. On the other were the poor citizens, once free, now sinking into servitude. The danger was not just economic collapse, but political collapse. Athens was not yet the democracy we remember. It was controlled by aristocratic families. But if the poor rose in rebellion, the city itself could fracture. Civil war loomed. Modern readers might imagine debt as a slow, invisible pressure. But in Athens, it was visible everywhere. The horoi stones on the fields were daily reminders of loss. Families begging in the agora were constant warnings of despair. Aristocrats feared revolt. Ordinary people feared starvation. The system was unsustainable, but no one dared move first. This was the moment when Athens appointed Solon as archon, granting him extraordinary power to reform the laws and save the state. Solon was not a radical. He was a poet, a thinker, and a statesman, respected by both rich and poor. Both sides trusted him enough to accept his judgment. The question was simple but dangerous. Could Athens reset the balance without tearing itself apart? Solon's answer was as bold as it was controversial. He declared a Seisachtheia, a shaking off of burdens. First, he abolished debt bondage. No Athenian could ever again be enslaved for failing to pay. Those already in bondage were freed, and many who had been sold abroad were bought back at state expense and returned home. Second, he canceled existing debts secured on the person. The horoi stones were uprooted from the fields of Attica. Land was restored to families who had lost it to creditors. In one stroke, centuries of contracts were erased. Third, Solon restructured the political order. Instead of power resting solely with aristocrats, he created new classes based on wealth rather than birth. This allowed more citizens to participate in governance, laying foundations for the democracy that Athens would later perfect. The reaction was explosive. The poor rejoiced. Families wept as they returned to land they thought lost forever. Freedmen embraced Solon as a liberator. The rich were furious. Their loans had been wiped away, their contracts erased, their power curtailed. Some accused Solon of theft. Others muttered that his reforms went too far, or not far enough. But Solon defended his middle path. In his poems, he wrote, "I stood with my mighty shield between them both. I allowed neither to win unjustly." He had given freedom to the poor without destroying the rich entirely. Athens had been saved from civil war, not by blood, but by forgiveness. Solon's reforms redrew the map of Athenian society. For the poor, it was salvation. Chains were struck off wrists, families were restored. For the first time, hope returned to the countryside. For the wealthy, it was humiliation. Creditors watched as their ledgers were nullified. Fields they had claimed reverted to their original owners. In their eyes, Solon had legalized theft. The middle ground was fragile. Solon himself admitted no one was fully satisfied. Yet this dissatisfaction was proof of balance. The poor wanted more redistribution. The rich wanted revenge. Solon had managed to steer Athens through the storm by angering both sides just enough. Compare it to 2008. Banks were furious at regulations that followed the crash. Ordinary people were furious that bailouts saved Wall Street but not Main Street. No one felt justice had been done, yet the system survived. In Athens, survival was victory. The alternative had been revolt and ruin. Solon's reforms did not end inequality, but they prevented collapse. And more importantly, they created a new precedent. When debt threatens the stability of society, mercy can be more powerful than law. Athens was not the first nor the last to confront the chains of debt. Babylon's kings had wiped tablets clean centuries earlier. In Israel, the law of Moses spoke of the year of Jubilee, when debts were forgiven and land returned every 50 years. In Rome, later generations would revolt over debt crises again and again. What made Athens unique was its outcome. Babylon remained a monarchy. Israel remained a theocracy. But Athens transformed into something new, a democracy. By breaking the cycle of debt, Solon made it possible for ordinary citizens to have a stake in government. Freedom from financial bondage was the foundation of political freedom. This link between debt and democracy has echoed ever since. When the American colonies revolted, debt relief was part of the debate. When modern nations restructure debts through the IMF or declare bankruptcy protections for individuals, they are, knowingly or not, repeating Athens' lesson. Debt is never just money, it is power. And when power concentrates too heavily, history shows that only forgiveness can restore balance. Athens' debt crisis is not just ancient history. Its echoes are visible in our own headlines. Take student loans. In the United States, more than $1.7 trillion is owed, much of it by young people just starting their lives. Entire generations feel chained, their futures mortgaged before they begin. The debate over loan forgiveness echoes Solon's reforms. Is mercy theft, or is it survival, or consider sovereign debt crises? In the 2010s, Greece, ironically the descendant of Athens, teetered on bankruptcy. Creditors demanded harsh repayment terms. Citizens filled the streets in protest. The choice was the same as in Solon's day: enforce the debts and risk revolt, or restructure and reset. Even wealthy nations wrestle with the arithmetic. Japan's public debt is now more than 260% of GDP, the highest in the world. For decades, analysts have wondered how long it can last. Like Athens, Japan has avoided collapse so far, but the horoi markers are invisible. They are written in bond markets and central bank balance sheets. The psychology is the same. People chained by debt lose faith in the system, they withdraw trust, And when trust cracks, democracy itself becomes fragile. Solon's lesson is simple. Ignore debt long enough, and it will devour both the poor and the state. Athens shows us that when debt enslaves too many, society itself is at risk. Solon's reforms bought Athens time enough to build democracy. But not every nation finds its Solon. Fast forward to today, and the spotlight shifts eastward to Japan. For decades, it has carried the heaviest debt load of any advanced nation. Yet, unlike Athens, it has not faced revolt or collapse. Instead, it has lived in a delicate balance where the printing press and central bank buying have kept the system afloat. But balance is not the same as safety. When debt piles high enough, history suggests it will demand payment through inflation, default, or political upheaval. Japan's quiet experiment may yet prove to be the modern equivalent of Athens' crisis, a nation forced to choose between promises and survival. And that raises the question, can modern democracies, like ancient Athens, reset the system before it shatters? Or will we wait until the horoi of our age, the mortgages, the loans, the bonds, become chains too heavy to bear? Because if Athens teaches us anything, it is this: democracy cannot survive when its citizens live in debt bondage. And if we ignore that lesson, we may find ourselves not in the marketplace of Athens, but in its ruins.